All right. Hello, my name is Adrienne Smith, and I'm the curator of the Gatehouse Museum. Today we are in the Sykesville Townhouse building, which is the seat of our government here in the town of Sykesville. This year, the Town of Sykesville's Historic District Commission worked together to update guidelines in order to continue to preserve the historical character of our Main Street. You can take part in our Historic District Commission meetings here in the Sykesville Townhouse on the fourth Wednesday of each month at 7 p.m. Historical sites and designations extend far beyond our historic hill. Beyond our historic district, Carroll County itself holds more than 60 other sites within the National Register of Historic Places. While the differences between most common historic property designations will be detailed in a special presentation broadcast later this winter, today we're pleased to welcome Peter Morrill of the Maryland Historical Trust Curator Program Manager to talk specifically about the history of nearby Raincliffe Manor and how the state works to preserve this particular site's history. Peter Morrill is a fellow graduate of the College of Charleston in South Carolina who has worked for the National Park Service as well as the Maryland Historical Easement Program. Since 2014, Morrill's worked for the Department of Natural Resources. Peter Morrill also evaluates properties for potential addition to the Historical Curatorship Program. So, if you know a property nearby that may be suitable for this program, we hope today's presentation might inspire you to take action to preserve our past. Thank you for being with us today, Peter.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks for having me out. I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about one of the properties that we have in our resident curatorship program, and that is a property now called Raincliffe. So we'll go through a brief history of the Raincliffe house and the people that have lived there over the years, and then I'll give you a brief introduction into what the resident curatorship program is and how it interfaces with public lands that are managed by the Department of Natural Resources. So we'll go back to the beginning, and the property that is now known as Raincliffe was made up of a few different parcels. More than half of the property was composed of what was patented as Dorsey's Dilemma back in 1762 by Edward Dorsey. It's also got some parts of Progress, Addition to Progress, and Mount Pleasant enlarged. Now, it's only small sections of that. You can see the Dorsey's Dilemma patent is for 348 acres. We're talking about just a small sliver of that 348 acres that was patented in 1762. But our story really starts with a man named John Hipsley. So in 1807, he starts acquiring land to put together a farmstead. So in 1807, he purchases some parts of Dorsey's Dilemma, from Edward Dorsey that originally patented the land. He also purchased some acreage from Mount Pleasant enlarged, which was patented by Benjamin Hood. The Mount Pleasant enlarged is a huge tract of land. I mean, we're talking just shy of 1,400 acres in the vicinity. So he had consolidated a few earlier patents that his ancestors had put together back in 1801. And Mr. Hipsley ends up with about 163 acres, 3 rods, and 2 perches of land. So a good, substantial middle-class farmstead that you would be finding in the early to mid-19th century. I've not done a whole lot of research into John Hipsley. Did some digging and haven't found a lot, so I need to hit some more archives, come visit you guys some more. He shows up on the 1840 census in this vicinity, and he's got him, his wife, his first child, and then 8 enslaved people living on his property. So he's certainly made improvements and is living on this property after he purchases it. So presumably he's built some sort of dwelling, has agricultural infrastructure along with it. In 1850, John dies, and in 1851, an equity court case comes up between his son Solomon and his son John, Joseph, excuse me, Joshua. I'm having a hard time here. Excuse me. And they then hire a trustee, who's Stephen T.C. Brown, to sell the properties of their father. So in 1852, Stephen T.C. Brown sells the property to Marcellus W. Warfield and George W. Warfield. So this is our first touch with the Warfield family back in 1852. Those two purchased the property as tenants in common, so they both have half rights to the property. Again, this is our 163 acres and change that was assembled by Mr. Hipsley. And they paid $2,791.37 and I didn't put that in there, but no, they made sure it was in the deed. So again, that $2,700, that indicates some improvements have been made to the property. I mean, Hipsley's been living there for the better part of half a century at this point before he passes away. In 1853, Marcellus buys out his William's interest in the property, so he owns the whole piece, fee simple. And then in 1855, Marcellus Welling Warfield passes away. Once again, we end up in equity court. So there's a court case between Josephine Warfield, who is his wife, and it also includes Mary Warfield and Ella Warfield, two of his children. And they end up appointing William Warfield, his brother, as the executor to the estate. He's appointed trustee, and they finally sell the property in 1856. And he sells it to a man named George Yates Wethered. Now, Wethered's an interesting guy. He's born on the Eastern Shore, moves to Baltimore, and spends the vast majority of his life growing up in Baltimore. But he goes west, and he gets into trading. So he's down in Santa Fe and New Mexico and California territories in the 1830s and 40s, when this is way out there in the middle of nowhere. There is lore that he participated in the Mexican-American War. I've not been able to find any military records referencing him, so he's also in his 40s at that point, so I'm thinking his participation is likely some sort of, whether he's aiding in supply or animals or something to the military. But he is out in New Mexico during the time of the Mexican-American War. In 1849, he comes back. The war ends in 1848, and he purchases this property about, 7 years later, and he calls it Chihuahua. And Raincliffe is known as Chihuahua through most of the mid-19th century. Presumably, it's a throwback to his time in Santa Fe and New Mexico and all of that. But he probably didn't live there full time. 1849, when he comes back, he buys 833 Park Avenue in Baltimore City, which I just took this picture today. I went down and had lunch at Mount Vernon Marketplace. So if you're in Mount Vernon and you want to go visit his house, it is now an art gallery. It has some lovely artwork up in there today, and the door was open, so I went in and had a look around. It was great. But he's likely summering or spending some measure of time at his property out here near Sykesville. Probably has a tenant farmer and is basically using it as an income-producing property, but it does have a fairly decent-sized house on it, so I expect he does spend some of his time there. The best piece of information we have on this property in the mid-19th century is a sale ad. When he is done with Chihuahua in 1868, he advertises it for sale in the Baltimore Sun, and we get a great description. These sale ads are just gems when you're trying to do architectural history work. You can learn so many great details from them. So he's talking about, the grains he's producing, the fields have recently been limed and are in good production, and we get a detailed list of improvements on the property. So, first of all, a frame dwelling consisting of 9 rooms, cellars, and a portico, which trips me up every time because they're referring to a porch, but calling it a portico, that they even give the dimensions of 12 by 40 feet. So it's a substantial piece of work here. He's got 2 springs of pure water in the lawn, a pump near the kitchen door, a manager's house, again, pointing towards this being run as a tenant farm and not so much his primary residence, a stone dairy, Schweitzer barn, corn house, sheds, and then, of course, no farm is complete without some apple and peach orchards and other fruit-producing trees. So this gives us a great look at how this property appeared in the mid-19th century. And if we compare this list to the buildings that are surviving, we've got it. So 2 good springs of pure water in the lawn. On the left is certainly an early to mid-19th century stone spring house that still has water flowing through it today. The frame structure on the right is of early 20th century construction, but is built over an old spring box. So there's your 2 springs of pure water in the yard. A manager's house. Sadly, this house was lost to fire a few years ago, but directly behind the main house was a tenant house. We got a good look at its construction. It is balloon frame, very much a mature balloon frame too. There are no guttered corner posts, no substantial timbers. I think it's probably pretty close to brand new by the time that sale ad is listed in 1868. And then we have the meat house, which is a beautiful log meat house. No chinking between the logs, but it did get vertical board and batten siding and beautiful scroll sawn verge boards on the gable roof. It's a really attractive building, and you can see in that interior photo, it has smoked a lot of meat in its day. So those logs are totally covered with creosote, and you walk in, it still smells like smoky meat all these years later. We end up with a stone dairy. This is located right behind the house, and it's a beautiful stone building with a hearth in there for boiling water for producing cheeses. It's another great building. Sadly, the Schweitzer barn is gone. I assume it might have even been replaced in the later Warfield period. If you look at early aerial images of the property, there is a barn just kind of southeast of the main house that persists up until the early to mid 1980s before it goes away. Sadly, I've not seen a lot of good photos of that to decide whether that is the Schweitzer barn that Mr. Wethered was using or whether it was a later dairy barn, because of course the Warfield family comes back and runs a substantial dairy farm on the property. And then we have the house. Now, this sketch is a little bit hard to see here. I apologize. This is a quick not-to-scale sketch that is included in the Maryland of Inventory of Historic Properties form. And it gives you the basic layout of the house. It's not to scale. It's not great. I hope to be spending some more time out there doing some actual in-depth architectural evaluation of the house. But overlaid over that, here's what I think is the portion of the house that's either constructed, possibly parts of it, as early as the first couple decades of the 19th century. More likely, it's going to get built by Mr. Wethered. But there's also the possibility that this is actually a Warfield family house, and we'll get into that a little bit. But when you walk through the house, the front entrance has really wide open space with the stair that comes down and the wall that separates the dining room from that space. If you look very closely at the plaster, there are very clear openings from the original windows and doors, and that was an exterior wall before the house was added onto. And then we combine that with the description of this 12 by 40-some foot portico on the house. You start seeing a plan here. I've also drawn a kitchen on the far end here. Now, in a photo coming up that we'll look at, you'll see this kitchen wing that no longer exists. So I presume that this is probably from that earlier period house and then is deleted later on in life. That is pure conjecture, so I don't have any good hard evidence on that yet, beyond this one historic photo that I can show you. But this is our working theory of what the place might have looked like. I've drawn 2 porticos on it. That might be overkill. Perhaps we only had one on the rear facade of the house. That's pretty common. But there's still some more learning we're going to have to do to know. But you at least get an idea that we're very confident about that footprint of the original house there. And hopefully we can do a tour or come back maybe sometime in the spring or summer and have some more answers for you on that front. But then we go back to the Warfields. So our friend Mr. Wethered had put out that ad in the Baltimore Sun in 1868. It is not until 1872 that he succeeds in selling the place. And he sells it to Charles Warfield for $10,000. So we've gone from a $2,000 property in the early 1850s. Clearly, Mr. Wethered makes some substantial investment in it, if not the Warfields. I mean, the Warfields are only owning it for about 4 years, so it's hard to imagine they're doing a whole lot to the place. Up to $10,000 valuation just 2 decades later, so a pretty good return. Charles was responsible for some of the most significant alterations to that early farmhouse that we know of. And he resided at Chihuahua until 1913 when he died. He really turned this place into a super productive farm, and they were known as one of the biggest dairy operations in this area of Carroll County. So definitely a good working farm. And he died intestate, and the property was then transferred to his only son, Wade H.D. Warfield. And here is some great photos that we got from our friends at the Sykesville Historical Society of the house as it appeared right around the turn of the century, based on the clothing and the folks that we've seen in there. And this is just a fabulous picture. So we've gone from this likely second quarter 19th century, pretty plain farmhouse with certainly a substantial portico that they mention in that sale ad, to a really over-the-top, high-style Second Empire Victorian house. I mean, he purchased this in 1872, and he must have wasted no time getting into this. This is a trend that does not last much out of the 1870s, and he went all in. I mean, we've got this great projecting stair tower in the front with a bell tower on top. It's got balconies. It's got the mansard roof that you got to have for a Second Empire house. And this fabulous deep porch with some nice articulation on the top of the cornice line there. So it's really, really nice house. If you look at the photo on the left, you'll see that wing that I was looking at before. Now, that does not exist anymore. There is an extension on that side of the house, but it is maybe half of the footprint of that wing. So what happened there? I can't tell you yet, but hopefully we can get some more answers at some point. But I assume that is functioning as the kitchen wing to the main house. If you're looking at the photo on the right of that is the west side of the house. The two windows to the right-hand side, those are within the main block of the original house. And you can see how the chimney coming through the roof there is somewhat asymmetrical. It's kind of pushed to the back of the house. That is the chimney that would have been rising out of the gable end of our earlier portion of the house. And then, of course, it gets extended to the north with the Victorian addition here. So a really substantial improvement to the property from Mr. Charles Warfield. So, stays in the Warfield family until 1927. So they're in there for close to 50 years when the property is transferred to Edgar C. Davis and Carrie Davis. And the Davises are responsible for, once again, another really substantial update to Chihuahua. They turn it into a big classical revival mansion. So they have gotten rid of all the frilly Victorian stuff that their parents would have loved, and they threw that in the trash and put on a gable roof. They got rid of the mansard. They cut off that big stair tower in the front, although we still have a little piece of it there. They only took it down to the roof line. And they put a big classical revival Doric order portico on the front of the house. You know, full double height columns. It's making a statement. Giant light fixture on the front. So this work is done, you know, they purchased in 1927, I would guess sometime in the early 1930s. We don't have a hard date on it. And they also put an extension off the rear of the house there. So if you remember the previous photo, we had 3 bays on that gable end, on that west gable end. Now we've got an additional 2 with another projecting bay window. So that goes on sometime, and that might even be a slightly earlier period than the front portico. We got to do some more investigation, but the house has grown substantially. The wing on the east side of the house is now gone. There is a smaller wing there, but clearly the kitchen operations have been moved to that rear wing of the house. So a big period of change here under the Davis family. They're on the property until 1944 when it's transferred to Horace C. Jefferson and Lois Jefferson. And if I remember correctly, I believe they were mayor of Sykesville in the late 60s, early 70s, I believe. And they are the ones that give the property the name Raincliffe. Before that, it's always known as Chihuahua, or we have all the earlier land patent names. And from what I understand, it's referring to his grandfather's estate in England, which is kind of a neat piece. So they're in the property until 1972, until it's sold to Raincliffe Venture, and it was supposed to be developed into a housing development. Fortunately, the Nature Conservancy and other locals had stepped in and approached the Department of Natural Resources to purchase the property, which happens in 1975. So it's been in state ownership since that time. So that's kind of a walkthrough towards the end of the 20th century, and this is where the Department of Natural Resources comes in. And I'll give you a little overview of our curatorship program. So again, I'm the Cultural Resources and Curatorship Program Manager for Maryland Department of Natural Resources. DNR is a big agency. It includes the Maryland Park Service, Forest Service, Wildlife and Heritage Service, fishing and boating services, natural resources police, fisheries. It's a large agency. And we are the largest single landowner in the state of Maryland. So DNR manages over 500,000 acres statewide. So it's a big piece of property. Most of this property is purchased for natural resource conservation purposes. So think specifically about the state parks around us, Patapsco, Gunpowder, Patuxent. All of these are following waterways. So the big idea here is try to protect natural lands around our waterways to protect water quality going into the Chesapeake Bay. But as you all know, historically, where do people settle? Close to water. So in doing large-scale land acquisition around these waterways, we've ended up with also the largest single collection of historic buildings in the state of Maryland. I don't have a hard number off the top of my head, but we're talking thousands of really cool historic resources. But the department's primary focus, again, is cultural or natural resource protection, not so much the cultural resource. So we've had a hard time with keeping buildings in use and keeping them in good shape. And so in 1982, a program called the Resident Curatorship Program was piloted by a predecessor of mine in the Maryland Park Service. And I'll tell you a little story about how it starts, but the gist of it is our curators get lifetime tenancy at a property, rent-free. We're exempted from property taxes because we are a state agency, in exchange for restoring and maintaining these properties in good condition for their tenure at the property. Today, we've got 44 active curatorship properties across the state, including the Raincliffe property. And over $15 million of private investment has gone into these, and that's certainly an undercount. So overall, it's been a pretty effective program. That's 44 houses that likely would not still be in good condition today. The first house that came into the program is called the Giddings-Baldwin House. This is up in Baltimore County near Baldwin, Maryland. And it's kind of the birth of the program. This couple, the Bartletts, were looking for a historic farmhouse to restore. They wanted something rural in that vicinity. And they saw this driving down the road and were like, oh, look at that house, that's perfect. So they get their realtor to reach out, and they come back and say, oh, it's owned by the state of Maryland. So they write a letter to the governor saying, hey, if you let us live in this house, we'll fix it up. And they said yes. So that is the very uncalculated beginning to this program. But since then, it's grown, like I said, to encompass 44 properties across the state. And we've had actually more than that have since come back and been put to other use. But that is the very first one. It's a great late 18th century house. I particularly like that one. And then we get Raincliffe. Nelson and Lee Bolton became the curators of Raincliffe in 1984. They're either the second or the third curators to come into the program. So like I said, the state purchased the property in 1975. There were some tenants in there that were not great. I've heard all sorts of stories about wild parties and things going on there. And then it went through a period of being vacant, at least 2 or 3 years before the Boltons were selected in 1984. And they went in and kind of did everything. It needed all new plumbing, electrical, the exterior. It's hard to see in the photo, but the exterior was entirely clad in asbestos shingle siding. All of that was removed. The windows were restored, storm windows added. They've really done a nice job with the place. They updated kitchens and bathrooms, but no part of the layout has changed since their tenure at the property. So it's really been a great fit. And they've been in there, so 1984, what is that, 38 years now? Well, it's almost 23, or almost 24, so almost 40 years. So that's Raincliffe today. A couple other properties, just to give you a flavor of what else is in the curatorship program. This is the Barron's House at Gunpowder Falls State Park, although technically this is more in line with Cunningham Falls State Park, which is managed by Baltimore County Parks and Recreation, but is state-owned land. This is a great house. It's one of our newer ones in the curatorship program, built in 1936, but it is a Montgomery Ward kit house. So these folks went and they ordered a house from Montgomery Ward in Baltimore. It showed up on a train car with all the pieces labeled, and then Mr. Barron's hired a local builder to put the thing together for him. And it was a really fun house to go into. It was a total time capsule. I mean, all the original wallpaper on the walls, nothing had ever been changed, for the good and the bad, of course. And we got some new folks in there that have been doing a really nice job turning it back into a home again. So kind of a 20th century example of what we got. This is another pretty impressive one. This is called Sandy Point Mansion. If y'all have ever been to Sandy Point State Park or driven over the Bay Bridge and noticed the sandy beach with everybody out sunning themselves, this property was purchased by the state of Maryland in the 1950s expressly for the purpose of constructing the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. After State Highways was done with their construction work, the rest of the property got turned over to the Department of Natural Resources, and this fabulous late 18th century 5-part house, and yes, those are original wings and hyphens, so it's a pretty cool place, sat empty for a better part of 20 years. This place was in really, really bad shape. I believe Parks used to use it for a haunted house for a while there before it got so bad that they couldn't bring anyone into it anymore. And then in the early 1990s, it was included in the curatorship program, and our folks there have done a beautiful job bringing it back to life. Unfortunately, all those years of neglect led to there not being much of an interior left anymore, but they've done a really nice job bringing it back. So if you're ever at Sandy Point State Park, pay attention to the house. Another great early one, this is vying with the Boltons for either the second or third, and I don't know the exact date. I should have looked that up. But this is the Quarrymaster's house. This is Seneca Creek State Park, so down in Montgomery County. And it sits on a bluff right over the Potomac River, a really beautiful site. And it was a quarry. So this really popular red sandstone was quarried at this spot through the 19th century. So a lot of the prominent houses in Georgetown and Washington, D.C., are faced with this really beautiful red stone. When you first cut it, it's kind of this peachy purple color, and then as it oxidizes, it turns this really beautiful purpley red color. So this would have been the Quarrymaster's house there. A notable building, the Smithsonian Castle in Washington, D.C., is constructed out of this red sandstone that came out of Montgomery County. Again, you can see the condition it was in. This thing was buried in the woods for years. And we found either a really intrepid person or maybe a crazy person, depending on what you want to call them, did a really fabulous job with this house. Dug it out of the woods, put it together. Actually, the log addition they put on was another historic property. It was actually a granary further up in Montgomery County that he picked up and moved to the site to get a little additional square footage in the house. Really fabulous job with that one. And then we have some other properties that aren't necessarily private residences. This is called the Raincliffe House. If you ever go to the beach at Assateague Island State Park, before you go onto the island, there's the National Park Service Visitor Center and a University of Maryland Research Center. You go back behind that and you'll find this fabulous 1744 brick house. This is actually vying for the oldest house in the Maryland State Park system. It was built by a wealthy merchant who was shipping goods back and forth from Europe. He ran a substantial salt works at the property, which is pretty interesting. We don't see a lot of interpretation of salt works in America, but I can't think of another substance that's quite so important to life than salt. I mean, today we think of it as a seasoning, but if you want to preserve food or do any of these essential life functions, you need salt. So a very interesting property there. It had a bad fire, sadly, in the early 20th century. So you can see the picture on the left. The great gable roof had been lost and replaced by this pyramidal one, and then it sat vacant for many years before it was purchased by the department, I believe 1999 or 2000. It sat empty for a while, and then in 2008, a group of locals got together and created the Raincliffe House Trust, so it's a nonprofit organization, and they did a beautiful job restoring the house. They put back the original gable roof, which we were fortunate to have historic photos of with the great kicked eaves, and did a really nice job on the interior. So next time you're going to the beach, this is worth a stop. It's open fairly regular hours. They have a great website. They've been doing some really good public archaeology there as well. They just did a dig of the enslaved people's quarters on the property, and it came up with some really fabulous finds, and we've only tested a small fraction of what's out there. And this property had long been thought to not have much archaeological potential at all, and we're learning it's quite the opposite. So a great one there. And last but not least, this is one that we actually have available. So if you want to take a look at our website, and I've got the link here in a minute, this is called Old Bohemia. So this is Cecil County, but the eastern shore side, right near the town of Warwick. So Maryland was the home to the Jesuits, the Catholic Church. They had spots in southern Maryland. They had the Cecil County spot. They actually were pretty close here with the college in Woodbine, not too far away from where we are now, and then also up in Pennsylvania. So the Jesuits had been at this property since the 1750s. They briefly ran a college there, but basically it just became a church, and they ran a plantation. They owned a couple thousand acres. This house is pretty interesting. It dates to about 1840. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with what's been kind of termed the Georgetown 272, but in 1838, the Georgetown University, which is a Jesuit college in Washington, D.C., ran into financial difficulties. In order to bail out the college, they basically gathered up all of the people they enslaved in Maryland and sold all of them to Louisiana. So Old Bohemia here lost its labor force and could not be a working plantation anymore. So the response to that was to build this tenant house right about 1840, a couple years after the sale, to be able to attract a free tenant farmer. And this house is fabulous. It's got, here's some plans that I drew up of it, but pretty standard center hall, single pile plan house with the kitchen wing on the side. But it's got all of its original trim, all of its finishes, floors. It's a real time capsule of a house that would clean up beautifully. So it's sitting empty now, but I'm hoping that someone might take it on someday. And with that, I'd like to say thank you. I hope this was informative. I wish I had more answers to all the Raincliffe questions, but like I said, I'll do some more investigations out there, and hopefully we can come back for a part 2 sometime and get into the nitty-gritty of the architecture. In the meantime, if there are questions or anything, I'm glad to field them.
Any other houses in Carroll County in the program?
We do. We've got a few, actually. There's, of course, Raincliffe that we discussed. The Gorsuch Cawthorn Farm is just a little bit further down Raincliffe Road there. We've got another cluster kind of up closer to Westminster. So there are houses along Morgan Run. We've got a great farmhouse that we call the Shipley House up there. It's circa 1866, really classic brick Germanic farmhouse. Yeah, double front doors, like the whole 9 yards that you would expect. We've also got the Clees Mills Miller House, so Clees Mill Road. The mill is long gone, but the Miller's house is still there. And we have a couple other properties that are not currently in the program that have some interest that I'm trying to work on. One we call the Barnes House. It's on London Bridge Road up there. It was owned by the Barnes family for many years. But looking at the 1858 Martinet map, it's actually listed as being owned by a guy named Isaac Kelly, and they actually list him as colored. And I think I can count on one hand how many times I've seen a person listed as colored on a subscription map in the 1850s, let alone in Carroll County. It's just bizarre. He clearly doesn't ever own the property. I've not found him on any deeds, but he's living there. And is clearly well regarded enough to make it onto a subscription map. So that's one I'd love to work on. It's a great early 19th century log house with a very early log addition to it. What else do we have in Carroll County? I think that's about it. We got a whole bunch in Patapsco a little bit further down, but it's all Howard and Baltimore County stuff. But I would say, yeah, Patapsco and Gunpowder tend to have kind of the two biggest concentrations, of course, because they're close into civilization kind of deal. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When you look to acquire new properties as part of this program, what do you look for?
So generally when we're considering stuff for the curatorship program, it needs to at least be important enough to be worth putting in the time and effort, because, you know, first we've got to put in the work finding someone, but then it takes staff time to look after it. So I have to go visit all of them every year. We do routine inspections and keep up with it. So it's got to be something at least reasonably important. Generally, it's not a great fit to have like in our major day use areas. If you guys have ever tried to visit Patapsco or parts of Gunpowder in the heat of summer, I mean, we're closed at capacity by 10 a.m. So generally, a house that's right in your major day use area is not necessarily a great fit. So a property that's got significance is maybe in an out-of-the-way corner of the park where you're not going to get disturbed by tons of visitors. Now, they're always going to be the public coming by, and part of the program is we do want to share these with the public, so you got to expect that. But generally, those are the best fit. And they've got to require a pretty significant amount of work. You know, if they're in habitable condition, we'll generally lease them out through a conventional lease, or we also have a big need for staff housing. You know, unfortunately, salaries don't quite keep up with inflation these days, so if you're able to offer housing to employees, that's usually a pretty beneficial thing. So usually those are the things, you know, location, and also, you know, beyond being kind of out of the immediate day use areas, it needs to be in kind of a desirable place. The issue we've run into with Old Bohemia is there's just not a lot of demand for housing in Eastern Shore Cecil County. I've had that listed on the website for a number of years now, whereas we will have a property in Montgomery County and I'll get 10 applications in a month. So you got to look at, you know, what's the reality of getting a return on that. But those are the major components. So it needs a significant amount of investment in a good location and a property that has some historic significance that we want to protect. Yes?
I knew the alley Cawthorn.
Oh, did you? Oh, very cool.
He was born about 1890, and he and my father-in-law were friends.
Oh, that's fabulous.
So I knew him.
That's a great farmstead. I mean, the house is a great layer cake of addition after addition after addition. And actually,
his two sisters lived there.
Okay.
After the parents died.
Nice.
None of them married.
Okay. We've got a few houses like that where all the sisters just stick around. There's actually another Warfield family house down near, it's in Patuxent State Park, right outside of Lisbon. That was another group of sisters that never married and all had a lovely life together at this farm. But yeah, that Cawthorn house is pretty incredible. When the current curators were working in there, they were doing some electrical work in the attic and actually pulled a Civil War cartridge box out of the wall. That was a Confederate manufacturer, so clearly someone deserted and crawled up in that attic and stuffed his stuff down in the wall so he could kind of blend in with the population. But the things you find when you're working on these places is just really cool. But I love the local connection. That's fabulous.
Captain Jefferson was a pretty influential man. He owned a whole fleet of ships or tugs, whatever. And he was, what was it? He was one of the last men to pilot, steer, an armed wooden ship.
Interesting. That's great. And of course, I just kind of touched on everyone's relation to the property, and we could go into everyone's stories. That's great.
I'm told that was in his obituary. If you look up Captain Horace Jefferson and his obituary, you'll read that.
Great. I'll have to look into that. Thank you. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Morrill. I also wanted to mention very briefly, if you're interested in the photographs we shared of the historical images of the Raincliffe house that were from our collection at the Gatehouse, the entire collection was from the photo album of Caroline Ridgely Warfield. And we've digitized the whole thing and altered the images just slightly to improve their clarity, and they're on our website now, all 85 images in the series, and we also brought the printed images and the originals today if you'd like to look at them.
Caroline Ridgely was lived in this house as a child, right here.
Yes.
Yeah. Mary Jones. I've been around a long time.
Well, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Peter.
Appreciate it.